Okay, so here's a new evidence hierarchy, and the one in the last video is fine. I just created this one because the last one didn't have all the study designs on it that I wanted to talk about. So what I'm going to do now is show you the breakdown, sort of a big picture breakdown in how to distinguish different kinds of study designs. Okay, so what we have here is at the bottom, the case reports, case series, ecologic studies, and cross-sectional studies are all descriptive studies. And at the top, we have case control, cohort, and randomized controlled trials. You can also call them intervention studies or experimental studies. Those are all analytic study designs. So what differentiates descriptive studies from analytic is that descriptive studies do not assess disease etiology or causality. So, as I said in the first video, as you move up the evidence hierarchy, you have a stronger case for causality, for a causal relationship between the exposure and the disease. So all of these study designs are looking at a relationship between the an exposure, like a cause of a disease or a protective factor, and the disease. And so that relationship, they provide more evidence for a causal relationship between the exposure and disease as you go up the hierarchy. So these bottom four study designs are called descriptive studies, and they simply describe the relationship between the exposure and the disease, but you can't infer that there's a causal relationship between those. So why would you do them? Well, you do them to generate hypotheses, and you also use them to allocate resources and plan programs. So if you know that there's a greater level of exposure or disease in a particular population or community, then you can decide to put resources to addressing those issues into that community. And so for analytic study designs, what they allow you to do is actually test hypotheses about the relationship between an exposure and a disease. So whereas the descriptive studies generate hypotheses, the analytic study designs allow for testing those hypotheses. And in all of the analytic study designs, there's an explicit comparison group or control group. And there are also two subtypes of analytic study design, which are the interventional studies or experimental studies, randomized control trials, versus observational studies. And the observational studies are cohort and case control studies. So it can get confusing. This may seem very abstract, but I think it's useful because sometimes you see cross-sectional studies just defined as observational studies, but it's all relative. So within the analytic study designs, which are the best types of studies, at least for looking at hypothetical causal relationships, you can separate them into observational versus interventional. And then overall, you could say that these studies are also observational because they just describe relationships rather than explicitly testing them. But anyway, so this is the big picture of how we describe and define the different types of study design. And so now I'm going to go through each of these types in more detail so you can understand what they are like and why they fall where they do on the hierarchy.